I had always believed that family was sacred. Blood ties were supposed to mean loyalty, love, and respect. I had devoted my life to raising my son, supporting him through school, guiding him through adulthood, and teaching him the values that I held dear. I had sacrificed so much late nights at work, personal dreams postponed, and countless moments of self-denial, all to ensure that he had the life I could only dream of giving myself. When he married, I was overjoyed. I had hoped that his wife would love him, respect him, and also embrace me as part of their new life together. I had imagined family dinners, laughter, shared celebrations, and the kind of bond that grows when generations support one another. But reality, as it often does, had a way of shattering expectations. It started subtly at first. The small things went unnoticed. Quiet sighs when I walked into a room, the way my presence seemed inconvenient, the sudden hush in conversation whenever I entered. I attributed these behaviors to adjustment, to the natural boundaries a new marriage creates. I reminded myself that my son had chosen his partner, and I trusted him to manage the household dynamics. But soon, the subtle tensions became impossible to ignore. My son's wife, Karen, began making remarks disguised as jokes, comments about my old-fashioned ways, my unnecessary spending, and even suggestions that I shouldn't interfere in household matters. I initially laughed it off, hoping it was mere immaturity or an attempt to assert authority, but the underlying message was unmistakable. I was no longer welcome, not really. The first real confrontation came one evening when I went to visit them unannounced. I had baked a cake for no reason other than to surprise them and brighten the evening. As I entered their home, I was met not with smiles, but with sharp stares. Karen's expression was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. My son looked uncomfortable, glancing between us as if trying to mediate silently. "Mom, maybe you shouldn't come by so often," Karen said, her tone casual but icy. "We like our space." I forced a smile. "I just thought we could spend some time together. It's been a while since we had a family evening." She shook her head, her smile insincere. "We're fine, really, we don't need." She trailed off, clearly searching for the right words, and I noticed the slight sneer in her eyes. That moment, brief as it was, left a chill in my heart. It wasn't just about wanting space. It was a subtle declaration that I was an inconvenience, an unwelcome guest in the life of my own family. For weeks, I tried to adapt. I stopped visiting unannounced, texted less, and tried to maintain boundaries. Yet, the tension remained. Conversations became curt, smiles strained, and I could sense the growing divide. My son seemed torn. He loved his wife, but he also loved me. I could see the conflict in his eyes, loyalty to his partner clashing with loyalty to his parent. Then came the day that shattered any remaining illusions. I had stopped by to drop off some documents for him, nothing significant, just paperwork he had asked me to handle. I knocked lightly, and when Karen answered, her expression was nothing short of contemptuous. "Oh, it's you," she said sharply. "You don't have to bother coming here. We don't need this old burden." The word hit me like a blow. I froze for a moment, unsure if I had heard her correctly. My son appeared behind her, looking mortified, but she waved him away as if dismissing his presence. "Burden?" I asked, my voice trembling but steady. "I raised him. I helped him become who he is. How can you call me a burden in my own son's home?" Karen laughed, a sound that was cruel rather than amused. "You heard me. You interfere too much. You're old, outdated, and frankly, unnecessary. We don't need you here." I stepped back, shocked not only at her words but at the brazenness with which she spoke them. My son, who had always been the bridge between us, didn't immediately respond. I could see the conflict in his eyes, love for me and fear of confrontation clashing violently. I came only to help," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the storm of emotions inside. "I've always supported this family. I've sacrificed for this family. And now you speak to me like I'm unwanted." Karen's gaze hardened. "Unwanted? Maybe you are. Maybe it's time you realized that the world moves on. We don't need someone like you interfering in our life. Your time has passed." Her words were like acid, eating away at the trust and bond I had hoped would never break. I wanted to shout, to defend myself, to remind her that respect isn't earned by marriage alone, but I stayed silent. My son stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, but I shook my head slightly. I think it's clear who truly needs to reflect on their behavior. I said softly, choosing dignity over anger. I'll leave, but know this. I've given everything for this family, and no words can erase that. I turned and walked out, leaving the air thick with tension and unspoken truths. That night I cried, not for myself, but for the family I had raised, which now seemed to be slipping away. The betrayal was bitter, and the humiliation was sharp. How could someone treat the mother of their husband this way? How could my son allow it? Over the next few days, I began to reflect deeply. I realized that confrontation might be inevitable, but the approach had to be precise. This wasn't just about pride. It was about truth, justice, and reclaiming the respect that had been stripped from me. Karen's disrespect had crossed a line, and though I loved my son, I knew I could no longer allow anyone to treat me as though I were disposable. And then I remembered something she didn't know, something that would change the dynamics completely. A part of my life she had never seen, never understood, never considered: my financial independence. While I had always lived modestly, quietly saving and investing, I had amassed a fortune over the years. This was money earned through decades of work, sacrifice, and smart decisions. Wealth that Karen had never anticipated. Wealth that I had kept private. Wealth that would soon change everything. The thought of revealing this secret filled me with both trepidation and anticipation. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about showing her that respect cannot be demanded by words alone, but is earned through recognition of value. She had mocked me, belittled me, and dismissed me, but she had no idea what she was dealing with. I began planning carefully. I would not storm in and shout. I would not act rashly. The revelation had to be strategic, undeniable, and impactful. Every move had to be calculated, every interaction deliberate. I knew that once she saw the truth, the power dynamic would shift, but I also knew that I had to remain composed. Days turned into weeks as I subtly re-engaged with the household. I offered advice, helped my son with his work, and allowed my presence to demonstrate value quietly. Karen remained aloof, her attitude icy, but I noticed cracks in her confidence. She underestimated me, assumed ignorance, and believed I had nothing to offer beyond the past. And then, finally, the moment approached, the moment when the truth would emerge, the moment when Karen would see what she had overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed, the moment when my sacrifices, my intelligence, and my foresight would be undeniable. I knew that after this revelation, nothing would be the same. The balance of power, the dynamics of respect, and the perception of who truly mattered in this household were about to change forever. But I also knew that this wasn't just about her. This was about my son, my dignity, and the recognition that years of love, sacrifice, and patience deserve acknowledgement, not mockery or dismissal. That evening, as I reviewed my plan, I felt a mix of excitement, apprehension, and satisfaction. Karen had tested me, belittled me, and tried to push me away. She had no idea that the woman she saw as old and powerless had quietly built an empire of knowledge, discipline, and financial security. And when the day came when the bank account and my life's work were finally revealed, I knew that everything would change, not because of anger, not because of revenge, but because truth, powerful, undeniable truth, has a way of demanding respect, correcting injustice, and restoring balance. The story of betrayal, disrespect, and quiet triumph was only beginning. And by the end, Karen, my son, and everyone involved would see that love, intelligence, and patience are forces more powerful than arrogance or ignorance, and that underestimating a mother's strength is a mistake that comes with consequences. After the confrontation in which Karen called me a burden, life at my son's house became a careful balancing act. Every step, every visit, every word had to be measured. I realized that patience would be my greatest weapon and composure my strongest shield. I refused to act impulsively, knowing that she was looking for any sign of weakness, any emotional crack she could exploit. The first few days were filled with quiet observation. I paid attention to every nuance in Karen's behavior, how she spoke to my son, how she interacted with the household staff, and even the subtle glances she cast toward me. She behaved as though I were invisible, her words clipped, her smile forced when she tried to mask disdain. But beneath the surface, I noticed irritation. She underestimated me, assumed I had nothing of value left to offer, and believed she had control over the household. I began to engage with my son more deliberately. I knew he loved me, and that he was caught between loyalty to his wife and his love for me. Michael had always been a considerate child, and over the years he had learned respect, but Karen's influence was strong. I approached him with a mix of caution and subtle guidance. "You know," I said one afternoon while reviewing some of his work documents, "sometimes it's not about arguing or proving a point. It's about demonstrating value quietly, consistently, and without needing approval." He looked up at me thoughtfully, sensing the wisdom in my words. "I know, Mom," he said. "It's just. Sometimes she doesn't make it easy. I don't want to upset her, but I also don't want to disrespect you." I smiled, masking the anger that still lingered from her insults. Respect isn't negotiable. It's something that must be recognized eventually. You'll see that if we handle this correctly, the truth will reveal itself without confrontation. Meanwhile, Karen continued her subtle attacks. One evening, she criticized my cooking, claiming that the meal I had prepared for dinner was too old-fashioned and not what her friends would enjoy. Another time, she remarked that my advice on budgeting was outdated and unnecessary, implying that my experience was irrelevant. Each insult, though carefully disguised as casual observation, was meant to undermine me, to erode my presence in my son's life. I realized that direct confrontation would be futile. Karen thrived on control, and any overt challenge would be met with defensiveness or retaliation. Instead, I focused on strategic demonstration, quietly highlighting my abilities, showing practical competence, and letting my actions speak louder than words. I began assisting my son in ways that were discreet but effective, organizing important documents, offering insightful suggestions on investments, and helping him plan household finances with precision. The subtle shift was slow but noticeable. Karen's dismissive smirks became tighter, her tone sharper, and I could see the small cracks forming in her confidence. She didn't yet realize the extent of my financial independence or the careful life I had built. In her eyes, I was an outdated, powerless presence, a woman who had devoted herself to raising a child, now irrelevant in the modern household. One afternoon, my son approached me privately. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "I noticed that Karen has been more aggressive lately. I don't know why. I try to mediate, but she doesn't listen." I nodded knowingly. "It's about control. She fears being overshadowed, even in subtle ways. Don't worry. I've faced situations like this before. The best way to handle it is not to confront directly, but to let actions reveal the truth. Soon she will understand that respect cannot be demanded, it must be recognized." I continued to manage my visits with deliberate timing. I arrived when needed, offered support when appropriate, and gradually demonstrated that my presence was beneficial, not burdensome. I noticed Michael becoming more comfortable. He began seeking my advice openly and implementing suggestions I made, often without her realizing the depth of my involvement. This quiet influence created an invisible tension for Karen. She was losing her control over the narrative in her own home. Karen's impatience grew. One evening, she remarked sharply, "It's amazing how you always seem to find your way into everything. Maybe you should mind your own life." I responded calmly, "I do mind my life, but part of that life includes supporting the people I love, which sometimes means stepping in when I'm needed. That's what family does." Her reaction was exactly as I expected, disbelief mixed with irritation. She couldn't comprehend that I could operate independently, contribute meaningfully, and still demand no immediate recognition. It frustrated her because it didn't fit her narrative of me as powerless or obsolete. Over the following weeks, I implemented subtle strategies to highlight my value without direct confrontation. I suggested improvements in household organization, shared insights on investment strategies that Michael had overlooked, and occasionally reminded the family of my long-standing competence. These actions were quiet but effective. Karen began to sense that she had miscalculated my influence and underestimated my abilities. One afternoon, while Michael and I were reviewing household accounts, I allowed a casual remark about long-term investments to slip. It's amazing how compounding works over time. Some of the accounts I set up years ago have grown far beyond what people expect. Michael's eyes widened. Really? I didn't realize the growth was that significant. I smiled faintly. Yes, sometimes patience and planning pay off. You'd be surprised what careful saving can do. I knew Karen was listening nearby, though she pretended to be occupied with other things. I could sense the subtle shift in her demeanor, the curiosity mixed with disbelief, the slight tension in her shoulders, the quiet urgency to maintain control. She didn't yet know the full truth, but I had planted the seed. The tension escalated further during a family gathering. Karen attempted to showcase her dominance, criticizing my suggestions, dismissing my advice, and subtly implying that my contributions were unnecessary. Yet, every time she did, I remained calm, poised, and quietly effective. I offered solutions that were practical, precise, and impossible to ignore. Slowly, others in the family began to notice the value I provided. Michael, visibly impressed, implemented my suggestions, creating a subtle shift in dynamics that Karen could neither control nor ignore. I realized that the final moment, the revelation of my financial independence, needed perfect timing. It had to be undeniable, unavoidable, and impactful. But until that moment, I continued to operate strategically, demonstrating competence, highlighting value, and letting Karen's impatience grow while keeping my composure intact. Karen's disrespect had started to reveal cracks in her confidence. She underestimated me and assumed that dismissiveness would silence me. But she hadn't accounted for decades of experience, intelligence, and foresight. Each subtle intervention I made reminded her, silently, that her assumptions were wrong. The tension reached a peak one evening when Karen tried to assert control over Michael's personal finances. I observed quietly, offered subtle guidance, and allowed her to act first. She quickly realized that her strategy was flawed. Her decisions were inefficient and lacked foresight. Michael, following my advice, corrected the mistakes without confrontation, reinforcing the subtle but undeniable influence I had cultivated. I could see the panic in her eyes. She didn't know what I knew, didn't understand my depth, and didn't anticipate the eventual revelation. She continued to assert authority, but each attempt was undermined by quiet competence, patience, and strategic intervention. At home, I began preparing my son to understand the importance of the upcoming revelation. I explained to him that timing, composure, and undeniable truth were key. When the moment came, it would not be about anger or confrontation. It would be about clarity, visibility, and respect. And so, the stage was set. Karen, confident in her perceived dominance, continued to act dismissively, unaware of the truth that was quietly building behind the scenes. Michael, now subtly aware of my influence, stood on the edge of understanding but trusted my guidance. And I, patient and composed, waited for the perfect moment, the moment when my life's work, my bank account, and my decades of sacrifice would finally become undeniable. That moment, when it arrived, would change everything. Karen would finally see that disrespect has consequences, and that underestimating the woman who raised her husband could never go unpunished, not through anger, but through truth. The days following my strategic interventions were filled with an almost imperceptible shift in the household. Karen's demeanor, once openly hostile, had begun to change, not in friendliness but in caution. She was sensing something she didn't fully understand, a subtle power dynamic she had underestimated. She hadn't yet seen the truth, but she was beginning to feel it. It all started with small incidents, things that were easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. One evening, Michael asked for my advice on a minor household repair. I suggested a simple, cost-effective solution that avoided expensive tools and unnecessary contractors. Michael implemented it immediately, saving time and money. Karen, observing this, frowned. "How do you always know these things?" she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. I smiled politely, saying nothing. I had learned that restraint was as powerful as revelation. Let her grow curious, let her underestimate, let her panic internally. The key was timing. Patience and subtlety would make the impact unforgettable when the truth finally came to light. The next incident occurred at a grocery store, oddly enough. Michael and I were planning meals for the week, reviewing coupons and sale items. Karen happened to call mid-conversation, attempting to assert control. She began to criticize our planning. "Why do you waste so much time on this? It's unnecessary." I continued calmly, explaining the long-term benefits of careful budgeting and strategic purchases. Michael nodded in agreement, clearly impressed. Karen's voice, usually so confident, faltered slightly. She didn't speak for the rest of the call, silently absorbing the knowledge she hadn't anticipated. I could sense that the gears in her mind were turning. Karen's unease became more pronounced when I casually mentioned some financial advice regarding long-term investments. I didn't reveal specifics, only spoke in generalities. It's remarkable how some assets can grow quietly over time if you plan correctly. Michael asked questions, intrigued, and I answered with precise, thoughtful responses. Karen, overhearing the conversation, stiffened. There was a hint of panic in her eyes. She began to suspect that there was more to me than she had assumed. At home, I maintained the same quiet composure. I didn't flaunt wealth or status. I allowed my competence and knowledge to shine subtly. The more Karen tried to dismiss me, the more obvious it became that I was indispensable. Her irritation was evident, especially when Michael implemented my suggestions without consulting her first. She had assumed that her influence would remain unchallenged, but now I was quietly demonstrating authority through results rather than confrontation. One afternoon, Karen approached me directly, attempting to assert dominance. "You know," she said sharply, "you can't just come in and dictate how things are run. This is our home now. You should respect that." I looked at her calmly, letting the silence stretch. "I do respect it," I replied softly. "That's why I wait for the right moment to offer guidance. Advice is most valuable when it's needed and considered thoughtfully. No one benefits from arrogance or impatience." Her lips tightened. She could see the subtle authority in my tone and demeanor, though she couldn't fully comprehend it. Every interaction, every solution I offered, reinforced the invisible truth she hadn't recognized. I was capable, intelligent, and not to be underestimated. The subtle hints of my financial independence began to surface unintentionally. Michael, curious about my past decisions and investments, started asking questions. I shared minor details about long-term planning, careful savings, and strategic decisions. I didn't mention exact figures, only allowed glimpses of my disciplined approach to money. Karen noticed Michael's attention and the respect he showed, and she began to panic slightly. The confidence she had assumed was hers alone was slipping. I noticed a distinct change in her behavior. She began monitoring my actions more closely, trying to anticipate my moves, questioning Michael privately about my involvement. Her arrogance was slowly being replaced by unease. I could see her realizing that her attempts to dismiss or belittle me were ineffective. Each subtle success I achieved, each time Michael followed my advice, undermined her authority in ways she couldn't openly challenge. The tension reached a tipping point during a casual family dinner. Karen, attempting to regain control, began criticizing my food and my suggestions for organizing the table. I remained silent, merely smiling and making small adjustments quietly. Michael noticed and subtly supported me, implementing changes I suggested without confrontation. Karen's frustration became palpable. She whispered harshly to him, trying to regain control, but he ignored her cues. I realized then that the moment of revelation was approaching. Karen's underestimation of me, combined with her growing anxiety, had created the perfect environment. All that remained was the right opportunity to make the hidden truth undeniable. I continued my strategy, calm composure, subtle demonstrations, and patient guidance. Each success, however small, chipped away at her arrogance and control. Karen was now operating in a state of quiet fear, sensing that I had hidden resources, knowledge, and influence that could no longer be ignored. One evening, she made a mistake. She tried to handle a minor financial decision for the household without consulting either Michael or me. The results were flawed, inefficient, impractical, and costly. Michael quietly corrected the mistake using my suggestions, and I observed silently. Karen's face betrayed her shock and panic. She had assumed that I had no influence or expertise, but the evidence was irrefutable. My quiet guidance had saved the day. From that moment on, her panic became more obvious. She began questioning every decision, scrutinizing my movements, and attempting to assert authority in ways that were increasingly ineffective. She was desperate to regain control, but the foundation of my influence had already been laid. Michael was now quietly aligned with my approach, valuing my input and implementing strategies that Karen could no longer openly oppose. The subtle hints of wealth, the invisible authority I had cultivated, and the calm confidence I displayed were slowly eroding Karen's self-assurance. She had tried to dismiss me as irrelevant, but each day, each success, and each carefully executed intervention reminded her that she had underestimated me. The stage was set for the first real shock. Karen's arrogance, combined with her lack of awareness of my financial independence, had created the perfect conditions for a revelation that would be undeniable. She would finally see what she had ignored, dismissed, and belittled for so long. The careful timing, the subtle demonstrations of competence, and the patience I had exercised were all leading to the inevitable moment. When she finally glimpsed my bank account and realized the extent of my life's work, everything would change. Her arrogance would be shattered, and the respect she had refused to offer would be demanded through the undeniable truth of my accomplishments. And so, I waited patiently, knowing that the seeds I had planted were now ready to grow. Karen's panic and curiosity had intensified, her control slipping with every interaction. Michael, quietly aware of my value, stood ready to support the revelation. All that remained was the perfect moment, the right day, the right conversation, the right reveal. When it came, nothing could be the same again. Karen's perception of me, my son's understanding, and the dynamics of the household would all shift dramatically. The quiet power of truth, patience, and strategic planning would finally assert itself in a way that could not be ignored. Life in my son's house had become a careful dance. Every action, every word, every suggestion had to be intentional. I had learned to act calmly, quietly, yet deliberately, demonstrating competence without boasting, planting subtle hints of my independence without revealing the full truth. It was a delicate balance, and it had become almost an art. Karen's behavior had noticeably changed. The arrogance she had wielded like armor was cracking. She no longer dismissed my advice so casually, and she was visibly anxious whenever I entered the room. She was like a chess player who realized too late that her opponent had been planning several moves ahead. The panic in her eyes was growing, though she tried hard to disguise it with forced smiles and clipped remarks. One morning, I arrived early to help Michael with some paperwork. I noticed Karen watching from the kitchen, arms crossed, clearly trying to assert control over a space she no longer dominated. I greeted her politely and began organizing files and reviewing documents with Michael. "Mom," Michael said, "you really know how to make sense of these numbers. I don't know what we'd do without you." Karen's face tightened. She tried to interject, but her words faltered. I can help too," she said, but the lack of confidence in her tone betrayed her. Every time she tried to assert authority, I quietly demonstrated competence, making her feel subtly inadequate. Later that afternoon, Karen attempted to orchestrate a small social gathering, inviting a few friends over. She wanted to show them that she was the one running the household, that I was irrelevant. I assisted minimally, offering advice only when asked, careful not to appear controlling, but my quiet efficiency did not go unnoticed. The preparations went smoothly, the event was successful, and guests complimented the organization and planning. Karen was flustered. She had expected chaos or criticism, but instead she was witnessing the undeniable value of my presence. The first real hints about my financial independence emerged unintentionally during this gathering. One of her friends asked casually about investments and savings, an innocent question that provided a perfect opening. I answered subtly, speaking of careful planning, long-term growth, and disciplined savings without revealing exact figures. Karen noticed Michael's eyes widening slightly, a sign of admiration that did not escape her. She tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but the seed had been planted. For the first time, Karen realized that there was more to me than she had imagined. She had assumed I was merely a retired parent living off minimal means, irrelevant and powerless. Now, curiosity and suspicion were replacing her dismissiveness. The tension intensified over the next few days. Karen began scrutinizing my actions, asking Michael questions about my past, and observing my routines closely. She was desperate to understand what she had overlooked, yet she was hesitant to confront me directly. Every interaction became a subtle battle of perception. One evening, I casually mentioned that I had maintained a few long-term accounts, investments that had grown significantly over the years. Michael, unaware of Karen's presence in the background, asked questions, genuinely impressed. I answered with calm precision, revealing enough to intrigue but not shock. Karen's reaction was subtle but telling. Her posture stiffened, her eyes flickered with surprise, and she bit her lip, a sign that the curiosity she tried to suppress was growing into panic. She realized that her assumptions about my financial status were completely wrong. The woman she had mocked, belittled, and attempted to push away had quietly built a life of independence and security. The following morning, Karen tried to reassert authority. "You know, Mom, we don't need all this. Managing everything for us, we're capable." I smiled gently, maintaining composure. "I understand, but sometimes guidance and experience can prevent mistakes that cost time, money, and stress. You might notice that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective." She tried to respond, but no words came. Her frustration was visible, her panic growing. I could sense that she was beginning to suspect that the truth was far more significant than she had imagined. The first glimpse of my financial strength came during a routine discussion about household expenses. I had suggested a small adjustment in budgeting, noting that reallocating funds in certain accounts would yield better returns. Michael, who trusted my judgment, asked me to show the calculations. I obliged, presenting clear, well-organized documents that demonstrated not only expertise, but also substantial financial growth over the years. Karen was standing nearby when the documents were spread out. She didn't read every number, but her eyes caught enough to make her stop in her tracks. Her initial disbelief was visible, followed by a mix of curiosity and panic. She realized that her assumptions about me had been entirely wrong. The woman she had dismissed as powerless and old had quietly amassed wealth and expertise she hadn't anticipated. From that moment, the dynamic in the household shifted subtly but irreversibly. Karen's dismissive tone became strained, her confidence waned, and she became increasingly attentive to my actions. She began observing silently, trying to anticipate my next move, her arrogance replaced by quiet suspicion. Over the next week, I continued to act naturally, subtly reinforcing my influence through competence and guidance. I did not flaunt my wealth or status, but I allowed glimpses, through careful conversations, strategic advice, and quiet demonstrations of knowledge to become visible. Each success chipped away at Karen's sense of control and superiority. Michael, now fully aware of my capabilities, began to trust my guidance more openly. He implemented suggestions, followed my strategies, and observed the results. Karen's attempts to assert dominance were quietly undermined by the invisible authority I had cultivated. She was realizing, painfully, that she had underestimated the woman she had mocked and tried to push out. One afternoon, as Karen tried to manage a minor home repair project without consulting me, she made several mistakes. Michael corrected them using my guidance, silently validating my expertise. Karen's frustration became visible, and she began to panic internally. She had assumed I was powerless, irrelevant, and dependent, but the truth was slowly becoming undeniable. I observed her carefully. She was beginning to understand that I was not just a retired parent, but a woman who had built a life of independence, competence, and financial strength. She was beginning to fear the inevitable revelation of the full extent of my resources. By the end of the week, Karen's behavior had changed dramatically. She no longer dismissed my advice casually, no longer asserted dominance confidently, and her casual remarks carried undertones of anxiety. She was beginning to suspect that I had a hidden life she had underestimated, a world of financial independence and intelligence she had ignored. The first glimpse of my financial power had created cracks in her confidence, and those cracks were widening. Every interaction, every suggestion, every quietly implemented strategy reinforced my value and undermined her perceived control. I knew that the ultimate revelation, the full display of my bank account and financial independence, was approaching. Karen was on the edge of understanding, her panic growing, her arrogance replaced by unease. Michael, quietly observing, stood ready to support me when the moment came. The stage was set for the inevitable moment. The tension, the subtle hints, the small victories, all had led to this point. Karen's disbelief, curiosity, and growing panic meant that the truth would no longer be dismissible or ignorable. When the day finally arrived, the revelation would be undeniable, unmissable, and unforgettable. The respect she had refused to offer would be demanded, not through confrontation, but through undeniable truth. The quiet, strategic patience I had exercised over weeks would finally yield its full effect. The days following the subtle hints of my financial independence were filled with a heavy tension in the household. Karen no longer attempted casual dismissals. Her arrogance had shifted into anxiety, and the small cracks I had observed weeks ago were now widening. She was beginning to understand, in an uncomfortable, unspoken way, that I was not the powerless, irrelevant presence she had assumed me to be. One afternoon, I was reviewing household accounts with Michael when Karen entered the room, attempting to regain her usual composure. "I just don't understand why you feel the need to interfere in everything," she said, her tone sharper than usual. "You're retired. You should focus on your own life." I looked up calmly, keeping my tone neutral. "I am focused on my life. Part of that life includes supporting the people I love. Sometimes that means helping avoid mistakes that could cost time, energy, or money." Michael observed silently, now fully aware of the strategic depth I had always maintained. Karen, however, misinterpreted my calmness as arrogance. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You know, I don't think you realize when to stop. You act like you know everything." I smiled faintly. "Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. The difference is that I accept when I am wrong and adjust accordingly. You, on the other hand, seem unwilling to accept guidance that challenges your assumptions." Her eyes narrowed. She began pacing slightly, her panic barely contained. I realized that the moment had come to reveal more, though not yet everything. Karen needed to see a hint of the power she had underestimated. "I understand your frustration," I continued. "But you must also understand that respect and acknowledgement aren't given lightly. They are earned, and sometimes demonstrated quietly until they become undeniable." Karen stopped pacing and stared at me, her voice trembling slightly now. What are you trying to say?" I leaned back in my chair, maintaining calm composure. "I'm saying that perhaps you've underestimated me, that's all." Her face flushed with frustration. "Underestimated? You're old. You have no idea how modern households work, how finances are managed, or how our lives operate. You're just irrelevant here." I didn't respond immediately. I let the words hang in the air, knowing that her panic was growing. She wanted a reaction, a sign of anger, weakness, or resentment. I gave her none. Instead, I opened a folder of documents I had prepared for Michael. Inside were detailed records of household budgets, long-term savings, investment accounts, and strategic financial plans I had implemented quietly over the years. Michael looked at them, his eyes widening slightly in appreciation. Karen, noticing the subtle change in his expression, leaned in, curiosity overtaking her arrogance. These numbers," she said cautiously, "are what exactly?" I looked at her calmly. They represent the financial independence I have maintained, the careful planning I've done over decades. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, but consistent, disciplined, and effective. This is not about pride, it's about responsibility, foresight, and security. Her lips trembled as she tried to comprehend the scope of what she was seeing. You've done all this, without us knowing. I nodded slowly. Yes, I never needed to flaunt it, because respect is not measured by wealth alone. But it seems the time has come for the truth to be seen. Karen's panic became palpable. Her face shifted from disbelief to anxiety, her hands fidgeting nervously. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't Michael say anything? Michael, still observing silently, looked uncomfortable but supportive. Mom, you've always been smart. I just didn't realize the full extent. You've always guided us quietly. Karen's voice rose slightly, tinged with fear and anger. This changes everything. You've been hiding this, and you let me treat you like nothing. I remained calm, letting the truth speak louder than words. It was never about hiding. It was about patience, strategy, and integrity. I wanted my value to be recognized for what it truly is, not assumed or dismissed. The room was heavy with tension. Karen's arrogance had completely crumbled, replaced by shock and panic. She had assumed control over the household, belittled me openly, and dismissed my presence. Now, the undeniable reality of my competence and financial independence stood before her, shattering her assumptions. For several minutes, no one spoke. Karen's eyes darted between me and Michael, realization slowly dawning. So, all those times I said, all those times I dismissed you. Her voice faltered, disbelief and regret intertwining. Yes, I replied softly, and each time I remained composed, patient, and strategic. Respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned, and the truth cannot be hidden indefinitely. Michael nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. Karen, maybe now you understand, it's not just about money, it's about wisdom, patience, and integrity. Mom has always been guiding us quietly, even when we didn't notice. Her panic turned to shame. She slumped slightly, realizing that her dismissive behavior, her arrogance, and her attempts to assert control had been both unnecessary and disrespectful. She had underestimated me, and now the undeniable truth was confronting her directly. I remained composed, observing her transformation. The tension in the room had shifted. Karen was no longer confident. She was uncertain, anxious, and reflective. She had begun to see the consequences of her arrogance and disrespect. Over the next few hours, the dynamics of the household subtly shifted. Karen began to ask questions, careful, measured, and respectful. She wanted guidance, advice, and understanding, even as her pride struggled to accept the reality. Michael, quietly supportive, ensured that she remained calm and that the discussion remained constructive. I realized then that the first confrontation had achieved its purpose. The initial reveal of my financial independence had dismantled the false assumptions Karen had relied upon. She could no longer assert dominance through arrogance or dismissal. Respect, long denied, was now quietly demanded, not through force, but through undeniable truth. That evening, Karen approached me privately. Her voice was softer, tinged with guilt. I didn't know, I didn't realize, I treated you unfairly, I was wrong. I looked at her steadily, offering calm acknowledgement. It's important to recognize mistakes. Acknowledgement and learning are the first steps toward respect and reconciliation. She nodded slowly. I want to make things right. I smiled faintly. Actions speak louder than words. Let's start there. The confrontation had reached a turning point. Karen's arrogance had been replaced by recognition, her panic tempered by understanding, and the household's balance had begun to shift. I had demonstrated that respect cannot be dismissed, and that patience, strategy, and quiet competence yield undeniable results. However, this was only the beginning, the full revelation of the extent of my financial independence. The complete picture of the wealth and planning I had quietly built over decades was still to come. Karen had seen a glimpse, but the true magnitude would leave her speechless, redefining her perception of me completely. The days following the initial confrontation were filled with an almost unbearable tension in the household. Karen no longer tried casual dismissals. She now observed my every move with caution, her panic quietly growing. The first glimpse of my financial independence had shaken her, but she had not yet grasped the full scale of what she had underestimated. I knew that the time had come to reveal everything: the bank accounts, the investments, the savings, and the carefully built financial security I had maintained over decades. This was not about arrogance or revenge. It was about truth, respect, and recognition. Karen had mocked me, belittled me, and tried to assert dominance over a woman she had dismissed as irrelevant. Now she would see the full consequences of underestimating me. I decided to reveal the details during a family discussion. Michael was already aware and supportive, and the household staff had been instructed to maintain discretion. I invited Karen and Michael to sit with me in the living room. Karen, unaware of what I had planned, approached the gathering with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Mom, what's this about?" she asked, her voice tense. I smiled gently. "It's time you understand the full extent of my financial independence. You've seen glimpses, hints, and subtle demonstrations. Now it's time for the complete picture." I opened my laptop and projected the carefully organized financial records. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, retirement funds, and savings plans were displayed in a clear, detailed manner. Michael's eyes widened, and Karen's face went pale. You have all of this?" Karen whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," I replied calmly. "This is the result of decades of careful planning, discipline, and strategic investment. Nothing was hidden out of secrecy. It was simply not necessary to flaunt it. I never sought approval or recognition, but now it seems the truth must speak for itself." Karen's hands began to shake slightly as she leaned closer, trying to comprehend the scale. The numbers were staggering, not ostentatious wealth, but undeniable financial security and independence. She had assumed that I was reliant on others, that my years of sacrifice had left me vulnerable. The reality was entirely different. I didn't know," she stammered. I thought you were just, retired, living simply." I nodded. "Simplicity does not equate to weakness. Discipline, patience, and foresight build power quietly. You judged me based on appearances, and now the truth is undeniable." Michael, quietly observing, looked at his wife. "Karen, maybe now you understand. Mom has always been more capable than we realized. She's always guided us, even when we didn't see it." Karen's panic escalated. Her earlier arrogance, her dismissive attitude, and her attempts to assert dominance had been completely misplaced. She realized the consequences of underestimating me. Every insult, every comment about being a burden, every dismissive gesture now seemed foolish in the light of the truth. I can't believe this," she whispered, her voice shaking. You've been supporting us all this time, without us even knowing." "Yes," I said calmly. "Support does not always come in visible forms. Love, guidance, and strategic planning are often quiet, unnoticed, until circumstances demand recognition." The room fell silent. Karen's mind raced as she processed the scale of my independence. Her panic was no longer subtle. It was raw and undeniable. She had attempted to control the household, belittle me, and dismiss my contributions. Now, confronted with the reality of decades of planning and wealth, she was forced to reevaluate everything. Michael reached for her hand, offering reassurance. "Karen, it's not about the money. It's about recognizing the wisdom and effort Mom has put into our lives. We've benefited from it every day, even if we didn't see it." Karen looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt, fear, and awe. I treated you terribly," she admitted softly. "I judged you without understanding, mocked you, and tried to push you away. I'm sorry." I nodded, acknowledging her words without immediate judgment. Acknowledgement is the first step. Actions moving forward are what truly matter. Her posture shifted. The arrogance that had once defined her presence was gone, replaced by humility and recognition. She now understood that respect could not be demanded through words alone. It had to be earned and recognized, often through actions that were quiet but undeniable. Over the next few days, the household dynamics changed subtly but permanently. Karen's interactions became more cautious, respectful, and considerate. Michael continued to rely on my guidance, and even household staff noticed the shift in authority and respect. The balance of power had clearly shifted. The woman who had tried to push me out now understood that I was indispensable, not just emotionally, but practically and financially. I continued to exercise patience, guidance, and composure. I did not flaunt wealth, but I allowed it to be visible enough that Karen could no longer deny it. Every decision, every suggestion, every interaction reinforced the undeniable truth. I was capable, independent, and deserving of respect. Karen began asking questions, careful, thoughtful inquiries about investments, long-term planning, and household strategies. Her tone, once dismissive, was now tentative, respectful, and curious. She wanted to learn, to understand, and to align herself with the reality she had previously ignored. Michael, quietly supportive, ensured that the discussions remained constructive. He recognized the shift in dynamics and facilitated a household atmosphere of respect, acknowledgement, and learning. Karen, slowly but surely, adapted. She began to recognize my authority and value, not through fear or submission, but through understanding and acknowledgement of the truth. The revelation of my financial independence was not about arrogance, revenge, or humiliation. It was about truth, recognition, and restoring the respect that had been denied. Karen had mocked me, belittled me, and dismissed me, but the undeniable reality of decades of planning, discipline, and strategic action forced acknowledgement. By the end of the week, Karen's demeanor had transformed. She no longer dismissed advice casually, no longer attempted to assert dominance through arrogance, and her interactions reflected respect, humility, and understanding. The household had settled into a new balance, one in which recognition of value, respect, and patience defined authority. I had demonstrated that respect cannot be demanded, that wealth and competence are often quietly maintained, and that patience and strategy ultimately yield undeniable results. Karen's arrogance had been replaced by humility, her panic tempered by understanding, and the family dynamics had shifted to reflect truth, integrity, and acknowledgement. The days after the full revelation of my financial independence were tense but transformative. Karen no longer spoke with arrogance or condescension. Instead, her words were tentative, her tone laced with guilt and anxiety. She had glimpsed the depth of my life's work, the wealth I had quietly amassed, and the decades of planning, guidance, and sacrifices I had made, not just for my son, but for the entire household. It was clear that the revelation had deeply unsettled her. She avoided eye contact at first, speaking only when prompted, and often hesitated mid-sentence. The arrogance that had once dominated every room she entered was replaced by nervousness and a palpable sense of guilt. She had mocked me, dismissed me, and even attempted to push me out of the home. And now, confronted with the undeniable truth, she could no longer maintain the facade of control. One evening, I approached her quietly as she was organizing a few household items. "Karen," I said softly, "I can see that this situation has been difficult for you." She froze for a moment, then looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and confusion. It has been. I didn't realize. I treated you so unfairly," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I smiled gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Acknowledgement is the first step. Understanding, learning, and taking responsibility for your actions are what matter next." Tears welled up in her eyes. I thought I knew everything about running a household, about helping Michael, about life, and I didn't. I judged you without knowing. I was so wrong." I nodded. "It's human to make mistakes, Karen. What matters is how you move forward from them. Respect, humility, and willingness to learn are far more valuable than pride or arrogance." Michael, observing from a distance, approached cautiously. "Mom, you've always guided us. Even when we didn't realize it, you were helping us, shaping decisions, making sure we avoided mistakes." Karen's guilt deepened. She began to understand that her attempts to dominate and control the household had been misplaced. She had assumed that my years of sacrifice, my guidance, and even my financial independence were irrelevant. Now, she recognized the depth of what she had underestimated. Over the next few days, Karen made small gestures of reconciliation. She asked questions about household management, sought my advice on financial matters, and began to assist with planning meals, organizing schedules, and implementing strategies I suggested. These actions were tentative at first, but gradually her confidence returned, not as dominance but as understanding and alignment. One evening during a family dinner, she turned to me. "I want to apologize again," she said softly. "I treated you like you were insignificant, like your presence didn't matter. I see now that I was wrong, and I want to make amends." I reached out and took her hand. "Thank you, Karen. Actions matter more than words. Let's focus on moving forward with respect, understanding, and cooperation." Her eyes welled up, and she nodded. "I will. I promise I'll do better." Michael, clearly relieved, smiled. "That's all we want. A family that supports each other, respects each other, and learns from the past." The emotional shift was gradual but undeniable. Karen's attempts at reconciliation became consistent. She sought guidance, asked questions, and even acknowledged the quiet influence I had maintained over the household for years. The arrogance that had once defined her presence had been replaced by humility, respect, and a willingness to learn. I continued to guide her patiently. I knew that true change required more than acknowledgement. It required experience, understanding, and consistent reinforcement. I allowed her to make decisions, offering guidance only when necessary, showing her the balance between independence and collaboration. One afternoon, she asked about long-term financial planning. "Mom, can you show me how to invest wisely, how to manage accounts, how to plan for the future?" I smiled. "Of course. It's not just about money. It's about discipline, patience, and understanding the value of thoughtful decisions." We spent the afternoon reviewing strategies, discussing budgets, investments, and savings. Karen absorbed every detail, asking questions, and carefully noting my advice. Her eagerness to learn was genuine, and I could see that the lessons were sinking in. She was beginning to understand that respect, patience, and careful planning were more powerful than arrogance or force. The household slowly settled into a new equilibrium. Karen's behavior reflected humility and understanding. Michael remained supportive, and I maintained my quiet guidance and oversight. The respect that had been denied for so long was now naturally acknowledged, not forced, not demanded, but earned through decades of patience, wisdom, and quiet competence. One evening, as we were discussing a minor household project, Karen paused and looked at me thoughtfully. "Mom, I realize now that I've judged you too harshly, assumed too much, and treated you unfairly. I want to be part of a family that respects and values each other." I nodded, pleased. That's all anyone can ask for: recognition, understanding, and a willingness to learn from the past. Her posture, once rigid with arrogance, was now open and attentive. The fear and panic of the initial revelation had transformed into humility and a desire to grow. She was no longer trying to assert dominance, but rather seeking alignment and understanding. Michael smiled, sensing the transformation in his wife. "It's a new beginning for all of us. Respect, patience, and understanding will guide us from now on." The days turned into weeks, and Karen continued to learn. She sought advice on investments, asked questions about household planning, and even consulted me on personal decisions. The relationship, once defined by tension and disrespect, was evolving into one of collaboration, mutual respect, and genuine family support. Through it all, I maintained composure, patience, and guidance. The lessons were not about financial power alone, but about life, respect, humility, and the importance of recognizing value in others. Karen was learning that respect is earned not by force, but by integrity, patience, and quiet influence. The household had shifted permanently. Karen's panic and arrogance had been replaced by understanding and humility. Michael's alignment with my guidance had strengthened, and I, patient and composed, had demonstrated that truth, wisdom, and quiet competence ultimately demand acknowledgement, respect, and loyalty. The days following Karen's initial acknowledgement of her mistakes were filled with small but profound shifts in household dynamics. What had started as tension and disbelief now evolved into curiosity, learning, and gradual alignment. Karen's panic, once intense, had transformed into humility and an eagerness to understand, not just finances, but the deeper lessons my life had quietly taught over decades. It was subtle at first. She began asking for advice about budgeting and household management. Instead of dismissing suggestions or acting impulsively, she listened carefully, taking notes and thinking through my guidance before implementing it. For the first time, I saw her willingness to change, to respect the experience that she had once scorned. One afternoon, she approached me cautiously. "Mom, I've been thinking. I want to do things differently. I want to learn to understand and to make better choices, not just for me, but for Michael and the household." I smiled. "That's a wonderful approach. Growth is always possible if we are willing to acknowledge our mistakes and remain open to learning." Michael, observing the interaction, felt a sense of relief. For weeks, he had been caught between loyalty to his mother and the tension caused by his wife's arrogance. Now he could see that Karen was actively seeking change, and he quietly supported the transformation. The first significant step came when Karen asked me to review the household budget with her. I guided her through the process, explaining strategic allocation of resources, the importance of saving for emergencies, and the benefits of investing wisely for the long term. She listened intently, absorbing each detail, asking thoughtful questions, and slowly applying the lessons in practice. I noticed the change not only in her behavior, but also in her confidence. She was no longer trying to assert dominance through force or dismissal. Instead, she was learning to lead with understanding, respect, and intelligence. The arrogance that had defined her presence was replaced with a measured, thoughtful approach, guided by knowledge rather than ego. The household projects we undertook together reflected this transformation. Karen began to take initiative, implementing organization strategies, assisting with financial planning, and even suggesting improvements based on what she had learned. Her actions were careful, deliberate, and aligned with the values of responsibility and respect that I had emphasized over the years. Michael's admiration for both of us grew. He saw the reconciliation and the collaborative effort as a turning point for the family. "Mom, Karen, this is amazing," he said one evening as we reviewed a completed household project together. "I never realized how much we could achieve when we all worked together." Karen smiled, her tone genuine and humble. "I realize now that I was wrong to dismiss you, Mom. I'm learning that respect, patience, and understanding matter more than control or appearances." It was during one of these collaborative sessions that Karen's personal growth became most apparent. She took on the responsibility of planning a small family event, applying everything she had learned about budgeting, organization, and strategic planning. The event was flawless, executed with precision and care, and received genuine praise from Michael and others in the household. "I never thought I could do this so well," Karen admitted quietly afterward. "I see now that I had underestimated not only you, Mom, but also the value of guidance and learning." I placed a hand on her shoulder, offering quiet reassurance. It's not about underestimating or overestimating anyone. It's about recognizing the lessons life presents, embracing growth, and understanding that patience and integrity always yield results. The transformation continued gradually over weeks. Karen began to participate in household management with a new sense of purpose. She no longer reacted with arrogance or defensiveness. Instead, she asked questions, implemented guidance thoughtfully, and acknowledged the expertise that had once been dismissed. The tension that had dominated the home for months gradually faded, replaced by mutual respect, collaboration, and shared responsibility. Michael, now fully aligned with both of us, encouraged the collaboration. He observed Karen's growth with quiet satisfaction and maintained an environment that reinforced respect, understanding, and practical wisdom. The family was learning to function as a unit, guided by experience, patience, and thoughtful planning. One evening, as we reflected on the progress we had made, Karen turned to me. "Mom, I can't thank you enough. I realize now that I judged too quickly, acted arrogantly, and failed to see your contributions. I want to continue learning from you, not just about money, but about life, respect, and patience. I nodded, pleased. That is the greatest lesson anyone can learn. Knowledge, experience, and wisdom are valuable only when shared, applied, and acknowledged. You've taken the first step toward growth, and that's what truly matters. The emotional distance that had once defined our interactions was gone. Karen no longer treated me as irrelevant. Instead, she actively sought collaboration, guidance, and insight. The household had shifted from conflict and tension to cooperation and respect. As weeks passed, Karen's growth became even more evident. She began advising Michael on strategic decisions, implementing improvements in household management, and even mentoring staff in organization and efficiency. She applied the lessons she had learned from observing my patience, discipline, and strategic thinking. The family dynamics had changed profoundly. Karen's previous arrogance and dismissiveness were replaced by respect, humility, and collaboration. Michael's loyalty remained steadfast, strengthened by the visible transformation in his wife and the guidance of his mother. And I, patient and composed, had successfully navigated a delicate balance, demonstrating that truth, competence, and integrity ultimately demand recognition and respect. Through this process, I realized that the revelation of financial independence had been just the beginning. The true transformation lay in emotional growth, reconciliation, and the acknowledgement of value beyond appearances. Karen's willingness to embrace change, learn, and support the family reflected a profound shift, not just in behavior, but in mindset, character, and understanding. The weeks following Karen's initial acknowledgement of her mistakes had proven transformative. The household, once dominated by tension, arrogance, and conflict, had begun to thrive under a new dynamic, one built on respect, understanding, and shared responsibility. Karen had learned to embrace humility. Michael had become fully aligned with both of us, and I had quietly asserted the authority and guidance that had always been deserved. Karen's transformation had become tangible in every aspect of daily life. She no longer reacted defensively or arrogantly. Instead, she approached each situation thoughtfully, asking questions, seeking guidance, and carefully applying the lessons she had learned. Her earlier panic had fully transformed into calm, measured awareness. One morning, I observed her reviewing the household budget, noting how she meticulously categorized expenses, prioritized savings, and considered long-term planning. It was clear that she had internalized the lessons I had imparted over weeks of careful guidance. I smiled, acknowledging her growth silently. "Mom," she said suddenly, looking up at me, "I've been thinking. I want to take what I've learned and help improve not just our household, but also my family's future. I want to implement strategies for stability, growth, and security." I nodded. "That's exactly the approach that matters. Planning and discipline are essential, but so is integrity and patience. Growth is not just about money, it's about relationships, trust, and foresight." Michael, observing quietly, added, "Karen, seeing you embrace these lessons, seeing you grow, it's remarkable. I feel like our family is stronger than ever." The first true test of Karen's transformation came unexpectedly. A minor financial issue arose, an unexpected household expense that required careful planning and allocation of resources. In the past, Karen might have panicked or reacted impulsively, potentially undermining stability. This time, she approached the problem methodically. "Let's review the accounts and see how we can handle this efficiently," she suggested calmly. "We need to prioritize, adjust, and ensure we don't disrupt long-term goals." I observed her quietly, impressed by her composure and strategic thinking. She was applying